13.8 billion years ago, an event of immeasurable potential gave birth to the universe. Today, we humans have come to know this event by its common name, the Big Bang. We learned of its occurrence by diligently tracking down and observing the signatures the event left behind. But despite our observations, we still do not understand two of the most important elements. What was the motivating force behind the event, and what will eventually come of it all? The undertakings of human beings, like that of the Big Bang, follow a similar, elusive pattern. What motivates them? And where will all of these undertakings lead are relevant inquiries, but plagued with uncertainty. History can provide a timeline of such actions, but often hides the conception and cannot predict the future consequences. Some 9 months after his conception, in May of 1899, a man of particular consequence was born in Rüsselsheim, Germany. His name was Fritz Adam Hermann von Opel. Baby Fritz was born into wealth and privilege. The Opels were a family of prestige, opulence, and nobility who thrived in the constitutional monarchy of the time. His grandfather, Adam Wilhelm von Opel, was owner of Opel Automobiles, a successful German car maker who came to be known as the Henry Ford of Germany. As a sporty young aristocrat, Fritz attended the Technical University of Darmstadt. He graduated with an engineering degree, and soon after went off to serve Imperial Germany in World War I, the war to end all wars. After the war, Fritz was swept up into the Opel family business and placed in charge of testing and publicity. Germany in the 1920s was a struggling shell of its pre-war self, but despite the depression, there thrived within a die-hard automobile culture. This is where Fritz began to make his mark. In the first German auto race after the war, called the Avus-Rennen, Fritz von Opel himself managed to pull out a first-place finish in an Opel automobile. Racing and spectacle were central to automobile sales, and such finishes helped propel the Opel company to achieve 1/3 of auto sales in Germany and become its top vehicle exporter. However, as the German post-war depression wore on, racing declined in popularity and a new hobby arose: land speed records. It was within this new playground that Fritz poured his energies. Somewhere along the way, he met Max Valier, an enthusiastic engineer known as Germany's first pioneer in the field of spaceships. Max was passionate about space travel. During the war, he served in the aviation corps, and there pushed the limits of propeller aircraft by personally flying them to their maximum altitudes. He gained first-hand knowledge of the limitations of the combustion engine and became convinced that there was only one way to get to space: on the thrust of a rocket. So in 1928, Max approached Fritz and asked him to fund and help design the world's first rocket-propelled vehicles. The idea was to start on the ground, with a rocket car. The end goal was to eventually strap a rocket to an airplane and perhaps one day fly to space. Max was all about space, but the possibility of achieving crushing new speed records must have been too tempting for Fritz von Opel to pass up. So he enthusiastically embraced and funded the project. The two were an excellent team, and although capable engineers, Max and Fritz lacked the means to create rocket engines, so they looked elsewhere for help. They found a willing collaborator in Friedrich Sander. Rocketry at the time was a crude practice. Friedrich Sander was a German pyrotechnics engineer and owner of H.G. Kord's company, producer of black powder charges for harpoon guns and signal rockets. Fritz and Max asked him to make rocket engines for their vehicles, and Sander obliged. A trio was formed. Sander came up with a simple rocket engine design, which used black powder as a propellant. The powder filled a 3.5-inch diameter metal tube, about 3 feet in length, and with a hole in the end for the lit powder to escape. Simple yet effective, they were much like today's model rocket engines. On March 12, 1928, a standard Opel Auto strapped with 2 Sanders-made rockets sat on the Opel Company test track. They lit the fuses and stood back in amazement as test driver Kurt C. Volkert blazed down the raceway for 500 feet at a top speed of 3 miles per hour. It wasn't far nor fast, but it proved the concept. More work was needed. About a month later, Fritz invited the press down to the trackway to witness the second test. This time they fitted 12 rockets to the rear end of an Opel race car and called it the Rack 1, short for the Rocket 1. Fritz von Opel himself test drove the vehicle, and although only 7 of the 12 rockets lit, Fritz managed a speed of 62 miles per hour in only 8 seconds. Impressive for the time. On May 23rd, about 3,000 eager spectators gathered at a Berlin racetrack for the first test of the Rack 2. A sexier rocket car, the Rack 2 had a much more streamlined design and incorporated 2 small wings to help push the front end of the vehicle down in case it tried to fly off the track. 24 rockets were installed on the backside, totaling in at a weight of 264 pounds of black powder. Although aware of the potential for disaster, Fritz insisted on being the test driver. His colleagues begged him to choose another, less worthy individual to risk his skin, but despite their protest, Fritz climbed into the driver's seat. He was a thrill-seeker and entertainer, and the chance to both promote the Opel Company and gain personal notoriety was difficult to turn down. So Fritz hit the pedal and shot down the track, leaving behind a cloud of smoke and accelerating to a speed of 148 miles per hour. Once the smoke cleared, and it was evident that Fritz had survived, he recounted to the press, "I step on the ignition pedal and the rockets roar behind me, throwing me forward. I step on the pedal again, then again, and it grips me like a rage. A 4th time. To my sides, everything disappears. The acceleration gives me a rush. I stop thinking. I'm acting on instinct alone, with uncontrollable forces raging behind me." The publicity was glowing, encouraging, and profitable, and to his amusement, von Opel had earned the nickname Rocket Fritz. A short time later, Rocket Fritz went on to set a new speed record of 124 miles per hour on a motorcycle powered by 6 black powder rocket engines called the Monster. Fritz was on a roll, but despite his newfound fame, his partners, Max and Sander, stayed focused on the ultimate goal, a rocket-powered aircraft. After all, Max was one of the founding members of the famous German Spaceflight Society, a group whose ranks eventually grew to include big names like Erwin Oberth, Walter Ullmann, and Werner von Braun. Fritz joined the club too, along with Sander, and the 3 of them journeyed to Wasserkuppe, a large plateau seated in the Rhone Mountains. Wasserkuppe was the mecca of gliders. Also known as sailplanes, gliders are aircraft that coast on winds and air currents without an engine to propel them. The idea was to find the appropriate glider, strap some rockets to it, and create a rocket plane. To aid them in their work, they acquired the help of Alexander M. Lippisch, a proficient designer of swept-wing, tailless gliders. Like on their rocket cars, Fritz and the bunch intended to install the rockets into the rear end of the glider and Alexander's designs suited their needs. In June of 1928, Fritz and Company purchased a glider from Alexander called the Inte, or Duck in German. It was an odd-looking aircraft, and looked much like it flew backwards. By June 11th, the rockets were installed, and she was ready to fly. On the Duck's first flight attempt, the rockets failed to fire. On the second attempt, test pilot Fritz Stamer, a different Fritz, successfully ignited the rocket engines and flew 1,500 meters on a horizontal column of superheated gas, the world's first recorded rocket plane flight. Buoyed by the success, Stamer attempted a third test flight, but after a successful takeoff, one of the rockets exploded, blowing holes in the wings. Stamer, however, was an unflappable, steely-eyed glider pilot, and he was able to safely land, extract himself, and avoid death. But the Duck burned and was unsalvageable. Despite the loss of the Duck, the gang was riding high. First rocket-propelled car, motorcycle, and now airplane. History was in the making. The concept had been proven. We could indeed fly under rocket power. Max felt vindicated in his rocket-high dreams and went on to pursue them further. Stamer went off with new business ideas and acquired military contracts. But Fritz was not satisfied. Always a showman, he wanted to pilot one of these rocket planes himself. This time, Rocket Fritz flew on a more traditional design that he also dubbed the Rack-1. And on September 30th, 1929, after a few failed attempts, Fritz was able to ignite a battery of 16 Sander rockets in sequence and successfully flew for 2 miles at a maximum speed of 90 miles per hour. Fritz later wrote an article in the New York Times exclaiming, "It's marvelous to fly like this, driven entirely by fire gases which escape from the nozzle at a speed of about 5,000 miles an hour. When we are able to make full use of this gas, we shall be able to fly around the world in under 5 hours." Today, thanks to rocket power, the International Space Station flies around the world every 90 minutes. About 100 years ago, an event of immeasurable potential gave birth to modern rocketry. The moment of its conception lies buried somewhere in the unreachable recesses of the past, lost along with those who came up with it. But the repercussions of their actions continue to exist to this day. And just like the Big Bang set into motion the creation of our universe, that first spark, that first rocket ignition, set into motion a series of events that will be felt deep into the future. And despite all effort, despite all of our wondrous technology, nobody can predict where it will all end up.